actually ask you all to share your experiences, if that's okay with you. So then I lost I lost my share. So let me get my share back. All righty, and go to the next screen. So then with all of the things that LaDonna talked about, the next question, of course, is, so what exactly is implicit bias and why does it matter to your clients? Now, before I even try to answer a question like that, it's only a few of us on the screen. How many of you have already been to 18,000,001 implicit bias training classes? Like, go ahead, show of hands, put the little reactions up. You're like, I'm tired of even people saying the word implicit bias, diversity, equity, and inclusion, but you just needed some CEU points and you're here. It's late. This is dinner time. So we're going to try to do this in a way that does not make you go to sleep over your food. Okay. So let's do this together so that doesn't happen. So when we ask this question about what is implicit bias and why does it matter to your clients, it's really something that you all know. I'm going to start very simply. Some of you probably, I can go hit it. Go ahead and hit it. Joshua, you're Joshua, or are you using Joshua's account?
Oh, that's just my legal government name. I go by Josh.
All right, Josh. So I was like, hit it, Josh. Tell us the definition of implicit bias. So then literally it's here, it's acting on the basis of prejudice and stereotypes without actually intending to. It's the script that's already on the hard drive. You can go to sleep and it's doing its work. I'm not sure how many of you made, if you're working from home like I do, but if you're not and you go somewhere, how many times you've made it there and not actually remembered the whole journey because your car is almost just doing the script because it knows what it looks like. It knows where the traffic stops. This is just automatic pilot happening, a script that's running in the brain. I see that even though the cable man was here, he did not solve my cable problem because I see that I am still freezing. So as long as you can consistently hear me, I'm just going to freeze every now and then. We're going to keep our fingers crossed that everything's going to be okay. So a couple of other terms that we may mention, talk about, etc. And then one of them is prejudice. And so that we know prejudice is just prejudging. It's a strong bias. And we know that a prejudice could be for or against something. Like, for instance, I have my one and only son. He's 17 years old, and I am very biased that he is the best child in the whole wide world. Now, I know y'all got your own best children in the whole wide world, best whatever, but I'm saying I put mine up against that, and my bias is for that. Now, what I say is that if children are lucky, there is an advocate in their lives that believes that about them, that believes in the power of who they are and the possibilities of all of the things that they can become in this world. And so then when that doesn't happen, or there may be resources or other things that get in the way of that, I know that is you, teams of people like you that help support families to make sure that things like that can happen. So children can have the advocates and the support that they need, that there could be biases for them. Now, biases can also be against things, and they can be against things in ways that cause the thing that it's against to be punished. So I'm going to contrast that a little bit later when we do a little bit more talking about the brain. But the stereotyping, a widely held but fixed and oversimplified image or idea of a particular type of person or a thing. And so then there's a stereotype that about women, that we're emotional. And so then we can't have our hand near that little magic red button because we're just too emotional and just not rational and logical enough. There are a million different stereotypes. We have these scripts in our heads. Any of you feel comfortable sharing any of the prejudging or the stereotypical scripts that you have running in your head? And it doesn't have to be anything serious. It can be something light. We're not there yet, but do what you will with it. Does anyone have anything they feel comfortable sharing?
I can try. Um, so, um, and it's kind of ironic looking back now because I am a gay person. But when I was figuring that all out, there were some stereotypes in my head where it's like all gay men like Disney or other things like that. It's like something silly, and then other ones where it's like they talk a certain way, and it's no, it's a lot of it is exposure to what you've been exposed to. It's heightened by the media, it's heightened by portrayal, and that applies to other groups too that experience stigmatization. And that's why it's so important when you look at media portrayals. It's like, do we go beyond the stereotype? Do we portray the intersectionality of these people's lives? It's like no singular identity encompasses a given individual. They're a mixture of all these things, which
Yeah.
I know that was partially an answer to your question, then diverted a little bit, but sorry about that.
No, you did a great job, Josh. So that's what we're going to spend the next 25, 35 minutes talking about, trying to work through those as an experience and how does that go along or not go along with some of the things that you're required to accomplish when you're working with families. So then this next slide is going to be some questions that I'm going to ask you all to help me with. So we're going to be probing bias. So what does implicit bias look like in the therapeutic alliance with families of colors? What is your experience with that? How does implicit bias show up for you?
I could try again if no one else wants to. Don't all answer at once. But one thing I'm thinking back to with before I was a graduate student at USF, I worked briefly as a middle school teacher. And one of my first real eye-opening lessons was it's like, okay, why aren't students doing their homework? And you make these different attributions. Some of them are internal, it's related to the person. Some of them are external attributions, it's related to the environment they're in. And I was very fortunate. I had a behavior interventionist working with me. Uh, and she herself was from a different background than I was. And so it's like she could speak to different experiences. And it's like, okay, you were educated in this way, you had access to these resources. And I mean, it's like, as much as I really don't like that word ethnocentrism, it's like there is such a thing as a bias blind spot. We all at times experience biases, and it can impair our judgment. But once we had that difficult, well, sort of difficult, but it was really a learning opportunity, I feel like. I definitely extended my grading policies to where it's like, okay, what am I more concerned with? Am I more concerned with the child actually learning or an arbitrary due date? And so that's kind of where I went from there. It's like, if you turn it in, you will get credit. There's extra credit opportunities. Like, my goal is for you to learn. But I don't have necessarily any direct infant toddler specific examples.
That's okay. So I'm going to ask one of you if one of you will help Joshua out, so he doesn't have to do such heavy lifting after a long day you all have been at work. How about someone else who's working with clients therapeutically and have had some experiences with um, that families get stereotyped and how acting that acts out in your work. I'm tongue tied, y'all. I'm like you all. It's just been a very long day. Who would like to help with that one?
I'll give it a shot. Um,
That
so
is Esther. All right, thank you,
yes.
Esther.
Um, so I'm not currently working with families this year, but I have in the past, and I am working with a lot more diverse clients this year. And I think that one way that it may have played out for me in the past is families of color, when they were coming into our clinic for services, sometimes had a harder time making it to appointments, having to cancel. We do have a strict policy because it is a training clinic about attendance to appointments, less flexibility. And there was, this questioning of, well, why can't they make it? Other families do. And then even when coming to appointments, I'm making attributions about why they didn't come in with like some homework done or with documents that you asked for. And I think that may have been a way that it could have played out for me in the past.
So what happened when you did the stereotyping? What impact did that have on your relationship with your clients?
Um, well, it was a very brief case because they never actually started the services. So that could be potentially a reason. I'm not positive. But I think it makes it harder to build that rapport with them for sure. And so trying to be more understanding about the circumstances that they have, how it barriers to even getting to appointments. And so trying to extend some more flexibility with them so that they can eventually get the services that they do need for themselves and their children.
So thank you very much for sharing, both Esther and Josh, because what we know from the therapeutic relationships is that outcomes are improved when clients and therapists are actually on the same page. When clients report that they've had a good time in therapy, they're more likely to follow what the treatment plans are, they're more likely to cooperate. When there's that misalignment, that can often happen because instead of us engaging the client, we engage in a stereotype of the client. We miss the opportunity to be curious about who actually is in front of us and what are the challenges that it may be or what it may require in order for them to engage and receive the services that we have prepared for them. So then I'll ask all of you the question, what's more important, the intent of your actions? I'm a good person, I'm a kind person, I have training. Why does race matter here? Or the impact when you're working with your families? And I'd like someone other than Josh and Esther to answer that question. What do you think is most important in this information when we're talking about bias? What's more important, is your intention towards the client or the impact that is actually having on the family?
Maureen, can I just sort of following up on both of the earlier comments, what I was thinking about in terms of the implicit bias piece was also examples of what it means to be late for an appointment.
Mm-hmm.
And the extent to which, okay, sort of chronically late can some sort of bridge over into resistant to services, can then just sort of, again, changing, sort of shifting across in terms of what intent is and what impact is. And like you said, in a relationship that really needs to be able to join, mutually join, it's like, let's just put one more barrier in the language that we use that differentiates, when at a time when joining is actually exactly what you want to do.
Yes, that it definitely does get complicated. When I think about intent and impact, I always think about it from a medical standpoint. Like, I imagine I'm driving down the highway, I hit an intersection and I hit a person. I crash into Leslie's car. Leslie's in the car. Leslie, you're in the car with your family. And I'm a little distracted, but I'm a really nice person. So I hit your car, and the first thing I do is when I get out, I want to know if you're okay, but I really want to talk to you, Leslie, about how nice I am. I want to tell you that I'm not a bad person. I really am a good driver. I've been to driving school. I have really good skills, and I apologize that I hit you and your family. But while I'm having this conversation with you, Leslie, your son, who's also in the car while you're driving home, he's actually bleeding out. And so then while I'm explaining, I'm not calling 911. You're kind of in shock. You're not calling 911, yet your child is bleeding out. What we do when we talk about intent and impact is we got to hit the bleed out first. We got to fix what's happening with families. And then we think about ourselves afterwards, because it's literally like that. While we're trying to figure out who we are and that we're good people and that we're kind and we're empathetic and we want to help, we have families that are just pretty much dying out on the vine. And so then we have to think about the impact of our work on families. Even the impact, as Anne was talking about, we're talking about resistance and noncompliance. You have a job that most likely you can take off from work. You have leave time, you have sick time. Some of the families that you're working with, you're working the same hours where they're working. They don't have adequate transportation. They have to take off from work and not get paid to meet you. If they miss the paperwork, you don't want to serve them. They got to go back, try that again. They're losing money every time. Bleed outs. These are bleed outs because we have really good services, and what's wrong with people for not coming on time and making it here and not understanding what does it take to get here for services that maybe may be better if you had one day a month that you did Saturdays, one day a week that you shifted your hours in the office and that you worked from 12 to 8, and that families could come in at this time after they've picked up their kids from daycare, and you had a daycare in there to take care of them while they were working with you. These are the kinds of things when I'm talking about intent versus impact, and that we are aligning services that do not match our clients. McDonald's would never sell you a burger that has not been focus tested. McDonald's would never sell you a burger if they had done work and recognized that the vast amount of people don't eat pork. They're not going to make a burger with pork in it. These are the kinds of things that we're talking about when we're talking about bias, when we're making products and services that suit middle-class families, but they're designed to serve families that have much less resources. Impact is that we have families that are not accessing services, not able to get the help that they need because it's just too complicated, overwhelming. And so they end up dropping out of service plans. So these are the kinds of things we have to consider when we're probing who is the work that we're serving, who is it biased for, who is it biased against. So then let's move to our next slide, because what I would like to talk about, but let me ask a question. Does anyone have a question about anything we just said or comment about anything we just said before I move on to the brain slide? So then let's talk about how normal it is to have an operating system just running. Your brain had an operating system that runs because it would be too overwhelming if every thought and everything we encountered, the human brain had to figure out whether or not it was safe to do it. You already know your house is safe. You don't walk in your house thinking, is it safe to touch this, to sit down on that? Your brain has worked out a lot of things. So then it mostly classifies, sorts, and regulates. That's what the old brain primarily is doing. We do have the new frontal cortex that gets a chance to mediate something we call the slower brain. Not that it's slow by any measurable amount, but it's slow enough that when some stress response thing hits the limbic, the reptilian brain, it responds with a stress response that will automatically then cause us to go into the fight, flight, freeze, fawn, flop stage. And so what happens a lot of times is with race has become a saber-tooth tiger. So that, when we think about saber-tooth tigers, when we think about whether or not saber-tooth tigers are safe or not, we think about, suppose some of them are safe. Let me do snakes, they're even better. If you're afraid of snakes, you know that they're beneficial snakes, they're poisonous snakes, etc. But if you're afraid of snakes, are you really going to stop to figure out how many stripes the coral snake has versus the garden snake? Are you running? Your brain doesn't have time. It's the stress response is already hit. Now, if you're not afraid of snakes, your frontal lobe, your new brain is going to go, oh, 2 stripes, thicker stripe. Oh, that's the good snake. Move on. I'm not going to be worried. But generally, you're afraid of snakes and you're going to do the stress response with them. Socialization has caused us to feel that way about people. People who are like us in our racial construct, if I'm white, if I'm Black, if I'm Asian, if I'm indigenous, if I'm a brown Latino person, those are generally the people who take care of me, who nurture me, who sustain my life. And so the cross-race effect, sometimes called same-race bias, is something that has been tested out in children as young as 3 months old. And that familiarity for them is something that their race, they begin to already know, not because their genius is to go, oh, we're white, or oh, we're Black. It's literally just because it's the face that actually nurtures, guides, and provides. So as humans moved around with one another thousands of years ago in tribal arrangements, when we encountered other humans, we were fighting for limited resources. So those other humans, they were others, and they were dangerous to us, and they were competition to us. Now we're not fighting for resources out in the field, but we've been socialized to fight and compete for resources with one another. And so those resource distribution has been beneficial to certain tribes of people more so than others. This cross-race effect means that outside of your race, on your operating hard drive, because of socialization, other people are dangerous to you. You didn't wake up, Robin, going, I'm concerned about those people. It's on your hard drive already. The media, everything in the air you breathe was already programming in your head. The others are dangerous. Those Black men don't take care of their children. Those Black men are dangerous. Lock your doors. They cannot be trusted. Of course, they're not around to take care of their children. Bombarded with messages that remind you that they are others and the others are not safe. And so you didn't wake up and do anything consciously for that to happen. The cross-race effect, the way it works is that literally within your own race, you watch and see every detail on a person's face, structure, identical twins. That's how growing up in a house with them, you know them apart, but other people do not. However, the others is just like the snakes. No one has time to figure out if that's a good one or a bad one. When you identify it as a snake or a person who's not like you, all of the things of the fears pops up inside of your head. It is why they have now thrown out a lot of ID, witness identifications in trials, is because in particular, cross-racially, we don't identify well. The cross-race effect actually impacts us from doing so. It's very unreliable. So then that's what I'm saying. On our hard drives, this need to feel safe and comforted, and socialization has told us that the others are not safe. And so it's operating in us. So we're not bad people. We're socialized to operate a way that benefits people like us. And so then that's what's happening there. Does anyone have a question about that? An example and or an experience, even before I go to the next slide?
I have an experience I could share.
I would love it.
I was brought up very loving mother till about 6. My parents went through a divorce, and then I had the wicked stepmother raise me. She was horrible. She was abusive. I survived because she didn't get her hands on me till I was 7. So fortunately, but I remember one of my first experiences in Kansas City, Missouri. We went to a pool, and she told us, and I don't want to offend anybody, but I'm going to tell you exactly what she said. When the niggers get in the pool, get out because you'll get dirty. I turned around and looked at her like, are you serious? I watched, I observed, I couldn't wait to get into the pool. Fortunately, I was 7 and I knew better. And I mean, that's just an example. It's like, fear because, it's somebody not like you, but also stupidity. I mean, anyway, I won't go on and on, but I just use that example because I am so blessed that I have questioned things from birth, and thank God. That's why I'm in this field that I am in. I still question things. So, and I hope I didn't offend anybody, but that was like from my heart. And I just thought I always questioned, and I have always gone out of my way to be with people that are different because I want to learn and they're interesting. I don't want to be around people like me all the time, but it's not easy because I'm shunned away from certain groups as well. So
it really isn't easy. We are really socialized to make enemies out of other people, out of a scarcity of resource. A little side note, Cindy. You said you grew up in Kansas. From the Public Works Act that happened in the 30s, public swimming pools were built all across this country. And they were built because wealthy people had access to country clubs, and working class and middle class families, mostly white families, then had access to public pools. It was desegregation that happened and forced states to integrate pools. There are pools all over the North, and I'm not even talking about the South, in the North part of America that were cemented closed, that were closed because white people refuse to have pools integrated and have Black people in them.
Yeah.
So that experience you're talking about, Anne,
Yeah.
is a well-documented situation in regard to scarcity, competition for resources, and white people closed pools, which meant that their children couldn't even go to these pools any longer because they refused to have them integrated. And so this is what I'm talking about with this cross-race effect, that in this country with race, it matters because we've been socialized to be afraid of other people. So oftentimes on this screen, if you are of a particular race and you do not have a lot of experience in very safe and nurturing environments with other people of color, you generally can't tell them apart, and they can't tell you apart either. So then you generally, if you don't have experience with Asian people, can differentiate a Japanese person from a Chinese person. You can't differentiate an African American from an African. They're Black people, and they can't differentiate you either. The cross race effect works the same way. You're like, I look nothing like her. I'm blonde. And she's like, cross race effect does not allow us to think about details of that nature. You're thinking white, you're thinking Asian, you're thinking Black. That's how insidious it is. And so that's what I'm saying. It's on your hard drive and it's thinking for you because you're
Maureen,
brain. Yes.
can I give a personal example?
Yes. Who is that? Because I only can see a few of you at a time. Who's that?
It's Anne again.
Go ahead, Ann.
I'm embarrassed to say this, although it's not at all surprising given what you've just been telling us about. It's like a year or so ago, there was a BTS song, the K-pop group, that I just fell in love with the song, and I was trying to figure out which member of the group had which nickname. And I'm embarrassed, I had to look a lot to be able to figure, it's a group of men, 5, I think, all around the same age. And I thought I should be able to do the differentiation, to be able to see them. And it's like, and I mean, it took me a while. I had to work really hard, and again, it's, I
What,
had a really tough time.
what ethnicity, what racial group did that group belong to, Anne? Those members of that group were what?
So an Asian group, a Korean, all young Korean men, all about the same age range. I mean, they were just, they changed their hair in every video. So some of the sort of more standard cues that you might be able to use didn't always apply. And so again, that sort of, it's a distinction in the category that you didn't have any practice with. And I just would add that too, that it happens with language too. And the structural rules about what are better languages and what are not so good languages, and how we, in addition to color, all those kinds of biases for the same kinds of reasons that you're talking about.
It is exactly that. And so then we're talking about implicit bias, y'all. That's what we're talking about. People are like, you're making this, we're not making this up. This is brain science. You've done it. You may not be willing to acknowledge it. How many times? I'm in places sometimes and there may be 2 Black people. There's me and LaDonna. They're going to mix us up. It's those 2 Black girls. They're both in the clinical field. You know what I mean? It's not anybody going, this is not about people not being kind. This is not about people not being nice. This is about your human brain being socialized, and you didn't ask it to be socialized. You were born into a race-based society that assigned value to people based on these races, and you are just acting out a script. And so the beautiful part about it is that the brain is so malleable, in the sense that Anne will tell you, years ago, we believed that the brain was fixed. It grew to a certain amount of synapses, and then maybe when the person was a certain age, it was finished. And so we now know that use it or lose it. We now know that the brain has the ability to adapt and be exposed to things and then create new synapses that could be different for us. So that the neuroplasticity conversation is one that gives us hope in the area of bias and implicit bias. So it is useful to know that all is not lost. There is some research that indicates why it may not be lost, and I'll go to that screen next. So there are some bias reduction strategies. The stereotype replacement, I'm going to talk about that, encountering stereotypical images together, is sort of like literally if you thought that Black men were something because you've been socialized to believe that, it's almost like countering it by finding something that disrupts that story, like searching out actively for something that makes that story, that stereotype, a lie. Because you got to bust that and interject that the facts are not lined up that way. You have to work for that, because remember, the media and what gets public attention is something that keeps reinforcing that story. So you have to work hard as an individual, and in supervision, it's a perfect place to do that. You work with your supervisor, or if you're the supervisor, you work with your supervisee. First, to identify places where you have blind spots, and then to figure out ways in which you can replace that stereotypical image with something that says that's not the truth. You then begin to see that if that's not the truth, maybe I can keep pushing and exploring that thought to recognize that that was a story that was handed to me, but it's incomplete. And so then individuation. That means that generally, like I talked about, remember we said snakes are dangerous? That means I don't think about corals or rattlers. I don't think about snakes individually. I think about snakes collectively, and they're dangerous, and I'm going to flee. So then now individuation would mean I study the individuals that actually are members of that group. I'm curious with my clients. I'm curious, like when we talked about the elements of reflective supervision. What is my family story? My family story is unique. When I get a chance to understand and engage in that story, I get a chance to think of this family as an entity separate from the stereotypes that are created around it. Now, perspective taking. This is my take on it. People, how many of you have ever said, if I were you, I would? This is my response. If you were me, you'd be me. There'd be nothing else you'd be. It's not like you were me, you would. What you gonna do other than be me? Yeah, otherwise, you still be you. So that's simple to me. So perspective taking is not asking if you were me, but no, really asking me about me. Really asking me what frames me. It's a part of thinking about what my story is. So perspective take is not saying if you was me, this is what you would do. You're not me. I'm me. I already feel in that role. And so then we need to now figure out how this is going to work, because we already figured out what you would do as you. So we have to step back and be curious with families, because we talk about empathy. If you're a social worker on the screen, we are taught to meet families where they are. We can't do that unless we begin to see perspectives from their angle, not looking at the story looking at their story through our lens. We have to ask out of curiosity, tell me what you see from where you are. Walk me to where you are so I can look at it through your lens. That's what that means on perspective taking. The increasing opportunities for contact is critical. Some of you may have had the opportunity to be in cross-race, mixed race environments. The key is the environment cannot be competitive. If it is competitive and a competitive grab for resources, automatically means diversity is a foe. It is a foe. When the swimming pool example was given, when you talked about that one, Cindy, your stepmother saw that pool and access to that pool as a fight for resources and competition. She did not see that as a share. So then her being exposed to people who were not white in an environment that felt competitive locked her in, and that they were a foe. You being young and more curious could then see them non-threatening, and then begin to be exposed to people of color and see them as potential friends. So what we know is that there is better performance, more satisfied workplaces, increased work conflict potentially if we know that competitiveness is at the seat of the diversity table. So then people go, we just got to mix more. We got to mix more under the right conditions. We have to mix more where we're solving problems together. We have to mix more where we're breaking bread and seeing one another in our human spaces as opposed to in our competitive spaces. One increases our ability to be at odds with one another and another does not. So then literally, this collaborative task and reflective supervision where you ask the questions, where you talk with your supervisees, and when you talk with your supervisor, you first have to recognize what your blind spots are. Or if you do not, it is helpful that your supervisor understands what your blind spots are so that in the privacy of that relationship, you can then feel vulnerable enough to trust and grow because the end result is your clients. It is your clients that it is important for those things to happen with. So then I'm going to ask you all, because we have a few minutes left, I will stay on the screen. I know we had a couple of technical difficulties. I'm going to stop sharing. If you have any questions and or comments, because I am so thankful that you have chosen to have dinner with me today, because I am sure this is your dinner time. So are there any questions or comments? And let me say this to you. They're all gone. Anne's not going to tell. You can say
And
whatever
it's not
the
going to
hell
tell.
Who said that? I said they were all gone. You're not supposed to be back there. Whatever you want to know, that's what you can ask over dinner. What is something that's been perplexing to you around these issues of implicit bias and whether race matters? What impediments are happening with you in the work that you do?
They're getting their thoughts together, but before they do, I just want to say thank you to you, Maureen. We're going to extend our time just for you to be able to stay on with Maureen, ask questions, dig deep. If you want to stay on and join our project for additional trainings and reflective supervision experiences, we would love to have you. So in the follow-up post survey, make sure you elect to join us. We would love to have you join us for the rest of the series. So on behalf of USF, we say thank you, Maureen. Thank you all for joining us tonight. And officially, I am turning it back into the capable hands of Maureen Joseph to finish out this post-training chat.
Thank you so much, LaDonna. So literally, I know you've all, like you said, you've been to 1 million trainings. It's almost like you got an annual tune-up training you got to have. And the word implicit's got to be there. Diversity's got to be there. Equity and inclusion. I'm sure you're fatigued. Tell me what's going on with you in this work and what impediments are there for you.
Honestly, I think this is like my 6th training, so not my millionth. I'm not fatigued. So maybe that's a little refreshing. But one thing I wanted to ask you about is because for one of my classes this semester, I was looking at a researcher, Patricia Devine, who studies implicit bias, and I was wondering if you were familiar with the prejudice habit breaking intervention. Was that a no, or
That was
was
a no, and I'd love to hear about it.
Okay, so very briefly, the intervention is based on the premise that implicit bias is kind of like a habit that can be broken through a combination of awareness of implicit bias, concern about the effects of that bias, and the application of strategies to reduce bias. The primary manuscript from 2012, it was a 12-week longitudinal study. People received the intervention and showed dramatic reductions in implicit bias. People who were concerned about discrimination or who reported using the strategies showed the greatest reductions. It's like you said, as far as maybe, while I would hesitate to use the automobile example of calling it an annual tune-up, it's like, I mean, the more you spend time thinking about it, I think that's even kind of a little bit like the basis for cognitive behavioral therapy. You spend time thinking about it, your thoughts become implemented into actions. But I like how you took some time also to mention the neurophysiology of it too, because our thoughts don't come from outer space, and understanding how the brain works and how it's like, I had never thought though from the perspective of neuroplasticity as a possible answer. And thank you, as always.
And so then I know I'm recognizing you. I'm going, I always see you when I come to speak. I'm usually in person, but I've missed you all. So we've had to do it from Zoom. But I really, like I said, in doing the research on this being exposed, really, Joshua, that key differentiation is exposure in ways where competition is heightened and increased makes it more dangerous ultimately, because the competition level it rises, and when it rises, it's a nightmare to have people in environments like that when they become even more entrenched in the scripts that have been socialized in their heads. And so what I meant by the tune-up is that it seems like every job is now not only making you take the training, it's making you take it often and annually, and the words keep happening. And it's like the training is important. The reflective supervision brings it home, though. Do you see what I'm saying? It's sort of like the training is like anything. Do you remember everything you learned in geometry? You don't remember hardly anything you learned in geometry. If you're going to be a mathematician, you need to be coached. You need to be doing that all the time. And so then in order for you to overcome implicit bias, it's not so much that you just keep getting training and told the same thing over and over again. In reflective supervision, in real time, you then get a chance to do something about this, because what we know is that outcomes for families are impacted by the relationships they have with their providers. And that when we want to improve outcomes for family, it means we have to do the work to think about who we are. Think about how we've been socialized and what impact that might actually have. Y'all, I'm looking at myself frozen. It looks crazy. I'm looking at myself. It's like why, like Murphy's Law, does the freeze catch you at some moment where you look like you're drunk? I'm like, this is ridiculous. I'm so over Zoom.
Maureen, you're not freezing on my screen. So,
Me either.
Oh, I'm sitting there going, I'm looking at myself like, and I'm like, y'all, this is a nightmare. Like,
so yeah, but we're not, for whatever weirdness of the technology, you're not freezing at all.
well, thank you. Because some of the looks I've seen in the freeze, I'm embarrassed. I'm embarrassed. Like, so thank you for that, Joshua. So Leslie, I see you nodding. Tell me about what this implicit bias journey looks like with you taking it into the work you do.
Actually, what I was thinking about was, with the brain, my father grew up in the South, segregated South. And, and I've talked to Professor Hogan about this in the past about, how I was kind of raised to be colorblind. And as I got older, I realized that colorblind wasn't any better than racism. But anyway, so, we never really looked at others as being different. Well, in 91, my dad was in a car accident with extremely traumatic brain injury, lost, big chunks. And so there was a lot of new pathways that had to be made. And it was one of the things that really stands out to me, because I was, a young teenager when this happened, is suddenly I started seeing all this ugliness towards races come out, because that's what he was around when he was younger. He just never acted on it. And so, the new pathways, and, suddenly my dad is saying all these disparaging comments against people of other races. And I'm like, who is this man? This is not who raised me. And, through a lot of physical, occupational, speech, behavioral, all of that, through many, many, many years of therapy, he is back to where he was, as I remember him, and not, a racist and all of that. It's so, what you were saying about the brain, that really resonated with me, because, that traumatic brain injury brought out a side of him that I didn't even know existed. But knowing what he grew up in the age that he grew up, I see where it came from.
And so Leslie, think about this. When I said the old brain is the fast brain, because when it's hypervigilant, when it's in danger, it retreats to what it thinks is safe. And so then what was safe was the world he knew and understood back then. So then it retreated to a place of safety. That's what I mean. The brain is
Yeah.
sorting, classifying, and regulating primarily whether you're safe or not. That was a space in which he felt more protected and safe in
Right.
and navigating. And so then he had to then now bring the new brain in with this training and all of the stuff people are doing and introduce new information for these new pathways to be reconnected. And that's what I mean. What happens is the stereotyping, the othering, the fear hits. And when it hits, it says fight, flight, freeze. You're going to fall or flop because it's sort of like a stress response has been hit. And the human body says, protect yourself. And so then we've learned to protect ourselves from one another. We don't see one another as fully human. We see ourselves as fully human and aspirational, and we see others, and we do confirmation bias by pulling out the negative things that we've been socialized. So then when we see something happen, going, see, you can't trust them. See, you can't trust them. See, I told you, you cannot trust them. And them is monolithic. There's not a them with red hair, a them with green hair. It's them. And so we've been socialized with our pigment to be afraid of one another at the level of pigment, that we have divided out value and worth of humans by melanin, the amount of melanin in their skin. And so this implicit bias thing, why I like to do the brain is because every one of us got one. If you're black, you're white, you're Asian, and they all work the same. We have not now have any scientific data that says that human brain structure and the structure and architecture of the brain works any different based on the amount of melanin that's in your skin, on the shape of your nose or the texture of your hair. It is the humanizing factor that all of them are responding the same. And so then just as you may feel threatened by others, others also feel threatened by you. How many times have you been in environments, not as many white people present, and black people have labeled you? And you're like, that's not fair. They shouldn't be doing that. Cross race effect. They are. You are, and they are. So then it's almost like extra work has to be done, like Leslie's father had to do. You got to lean in and get curious and individuate that person because you want to be individuated. And so the lean in now allows the other person who is also having some thoughts about you. That suppose every time one of these fathers show up someplace, they're a white person who's telling them what they should have done. A white person telling them how they're inadequate, how they're not good at anything, or blah, 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 blah. And they're not necessarily saying it with the words. Sending them home after they took a half day off already, not trying to pull them on the side and going, let me hold on 1 second, let me see what we can do. Never showing up like the face of safety and or support means that when the next white person shows up, they look dangerous too. Over and over again. That has an impact on compliance. That has an impact. And you're like, why would someone do that? They're cutting off their nose to spite their face, because the human brain wants to be safe, not in the long term, in the immediacy. It wants to be safe. It is not thinking about next year. It is thinking about being safe at the moment. At the moment of transaction, the human brain is trying to be safe. And so this implicit bias work, you're going to be hearing people talk about it. I want you to inject the brain conversation, and I want you to think about your own brain, and then think about other human brains are working that way. And what is it that I can do to override my old brain, override everything I've been told, and figure out how to look at a person in front of me and figure out what needs to happen in our relationship so outcomes can be different for this family. I want you to think about this. You change the trajectory of a family. You change the trajectory of it intergenerationally. You're not just helping that baby, that father, that co-parented mother. You're changing the trajectory of the baby's experience, the baby's access to education and housing, the baby's livelihood, and the baby's babies, and so on and so on. This work keeps seeding itself, and so implicit bias is everything when we're talking about changing what families look like. So please, I know it's fatiguing to hear the same words over and over again. It is fatiguing, but the impact intergenerationally on families needing less of us to show up because they're able to have the resources they need to be able to thrive is what the goal of this work that we're doing. I say we do this work to become obsolete. We don't do this work because we want our children doing this work. I don't want my son to be a social worker. I want there not to be a need for a social worker when my grandchildren are here. That's why I do the work. I want to thank all of you again. I am here. Ask me what you want and or will. Because I love St. Pete and because University of South Florida knows it, I am sure you will see me again. And I will be very thankful when I do meet you again.
And in person?
Look, I got both my vaccinations. I am doubly vaccinated. As of March 31st, I am ready to fly. So Annie, did you have any questions?
No, ma'am. Thank you. Thank you so much. It was a good training. Thank you. I love you, and I love Ladonna. I love her too. Thank you so much.
You're
God
welcome.
bless you.
Thank you. So Christina, you've been quiet, but you've been nodding. What's that thought running across your head you haven't
I
said?
think I'm ready to ask my question.
All right, I'm ready, Christina.
Okay. I wanted to have your opinion on a situation that happened with me. I'm faculty here in the psychology department, and the situation that happened was regarding me and a research assistant, and it was like 5 to 10 years ago, so very long, but I still remember this student was applying to become a research assistant in another faculty's lab that was outside of our department. Um, I think they were Tampa, but I'm not certain. And they told me that they saw only other white students in that other person's lab, and they were denied a position with them and felt like it was racially motivated. And I had a discussion with her, but didn't do anything further. I was wondering, what would you recommend that I could have done in a situation like that?
And that situation, I know young people now, Josh will know what I'm talking about. That's that gaslighting thing. It's sort of like when you're a person of color and you bring things to the attention of white people, oftentimes the first response is that you're overreacting. And it's because you're thinking of intent, Christina. You're thinking of your colleague and you're going, my colleague is a kind person, but your colleague had a lab that was full of white people because of the cross-race effect, who they felt comfortable with. That means other people are automatically getting shut out. At this time, we know that if you look up statistical information, that people of non-white people with certain names that sound non-white. My name is Maureen. It's as white as it comes. It's an Irish name. My mom picked that name on purpose to delude you all. You don't know I'm Black until I show up on the screen. My brother's name is Dexter. The other one's name is Wade. The other one's name is Keith. My mother was like, I'm not playing with these names. They're going to have to meet you to know. Because people are literally getting excluded because automatically that bias is showing up when their name shows up. Housing statistics that show that they'll send out sample families, a Black one and a white one, The house is available when the white one is there. The house is not available. This bias of wanting to be with people like you is rampant. And so then those situations, I would literally listen and think from the side of impact. If I were at a university that were historically Black, and I were one of the few white people there, and I'm watching all of the labs with all Black people in it, I'm applying to be in the lab. That's that empathy perspective taking one. Do you see what I'm saying? Position yourself and run through some of these scenarios and go, I know what brains do. It's possible. It's not because the professor probably explicitly was even imagining that. The professor probably used words, Christina, like fit. I don't know if she's a good fit. That's the kind of stuff you will hear.
I
Fit
did.
me. Is that
I
the
went.
language you heard?
No, I went to. I was at a decolonizing conference, and Dr. Amanda Sullivan explained that exact aspect. And this being so long ago for me, I didn't like do anything further from having the discussion. And now I feel like maybe I should have actually attempted to have a discussion with that person, even though I didn't personally know them at all.
So what I'm going to suggest, Christina, is to really sit and listen with open ears when a person says this to you, because oftentimes people are like, you're playing the race card, you're overreacting. Statistically, they're not. So then those statistics are comprised of individual situations. Listen for impact. And then with an open heart, open ears, and an open mind, begin to use some of those strategies about perspective taking, individuation. What if I were in the reverse situation? What conclusions might I reach? Who would I like to hear me? And what would I like them to do with that information? Do you see what I'm saying? Generally, Christina, if you had accepted that, it would have also said something to you about you. Your rejection of that was not just about the other professor. It was about, if this is the truth, we're all being called racist and we're nice people. Do you see
Yeah.
what I'm saying?
She was one of the students in my lab, so I had already accepted her. But when I was continuing halfway through the discussion with her, because I wasn't making the actual step to do something about it, then she did talk to me about the racial composition of my lab. And I might have gotten defensive, but I did point out one or two or three people from the past. But I think that because she made that statement, it meant that I wasn't affirming enough to her, and that I should have done more to change the situation, because I have a level of power and influence that she doesn't have as that student. So now I'm saying that I think I'm going to be more confident in the future and take actionable steps in those types of situations for the future.
Because oftentimes when I'm in environments with mostly white people, I have decisions to make. I have a decision to make. Am I going to be silent? Because otherwise I could be silenced. And so then that means I could then run the risk of possibly losing my job because I'm vocal, or I could be thought of as angry. And if I'm angry, I'm not a good fit because I'm always bringing up that race stuff. And everything is not about race. And so then you see what I'm saying? I'm positioning myself that means I got to be quiet and hope that, Christina, you like me a lot as a person. See how hard I work, and then trust that you have the courage in an environment like that to push for me, because I really can't push my way through without getting negative labels and potentially harming my own career. It's a very volatile situation in those. So I would say first hear, and do not make judgment in that sense. I'm unaware of that. I'm glad you brought that to my attention. I really need to think about that. So now you're not accusing anybody of anything. You're going to now step back and examine some things, because now you have to consider that the possibility exists that that could be the truth. And it's not personal against you. Remember what we talked about. The script runs in the brain that we like to be around people who look, behave, think, and do the things we do and look the way we look. Because that's what we've been socialized, that that is safe. So it is no wonder that our neighborhoods are segregated, our schools are segregated, and God forbid the way we worship him is also segregated. King said that church hour on Sundays is the most segregated time in America. So I'm saying even the way we worship God looks different. So we have to consider that the experiences of marginalized people, they need mentors and champions in the space, because they can't do the work without getting burned. And so then making a way for equity, it's a courageous thing to do. It's one of the things that hopefully you feel comfortable with, and that you may have a supervisor or a relationship, then that you then get a chance to be in reflective supervision coach through what that collaboration could look like to benefit other people.
Thank you, Maureen. I appreciate you unpacking the situation with me.
You know, Christina, I'm thinking to allow yourself some grace. Because I can tell, even though that happened a long time ago, you're still, it's really bothering you and it's still weighing on you. But allow yourself some forgiveness and just change how you do going forward.
Thank you,
Because now
Leslie.
your eyes are more opened.
Thank you, Leslie. That was really important.
Yeah, that was
in this-
beautiful. Thank you, Leslie.
Yeah, because in this cancel culture, there is no room for mistakes. We do not have a tolerance of mistakes. And we have to be human with one another and build compassion and grace into our interactions. And it's complicated because socialization tells us to be afraid of one another. And so the scariest thing to do is to be vulnerable with one another. So what I want to say to you all is that I know you're sometimes fatigued about these words, but I want you to lean in into not just hearing this as a training, but figuring out how to be this work, how to do this work, how to be compassionate, like Leslie said, with yourselves while you're growing and learning, and to begin to see and hear experiences from other people's perspectives. And you got a look on your face. What is that look about?
Shame is a hard place to learn from.
Mm.
And that's goes back to why reflective supervision then is so essential, because feelings of failure and shame are not a good launch pad. And most of the time when I'm thinking about that, I'm thinking about how it's so important that we don't shame children and then expect them to be able to learn. Right. It's like, you just put somebody in a place where it's going to be almost impossible to learn. And so you're just setting up for more. And so I think finding, as Leslie said, allowing ourselves grace, finding, and our reflective supervisors helping us get back to that place, because, there will be many mistakes made, and even as we're changing how we think about intention and linking intention and impact in maybe different ways than we have before. But that also means then accepting sometimes more of a sense of disappointment in self. And we have to have all of that together.
And I don't know if any of you know it, Brene Brown does absolutely exceptional work and has been studying the concept of guilt and shame and embarrassment in issues in regard to this. Christina, I would recommend you Google her. She talks about how shame and guilt gets in the way of us really being heartfelt in this work, and it impedes our ability to actually forgive ourselves for things that, like I said, we've been socialized to behave like. And trying to break the inertia of that is a lot. It's a lot. And so then the grace that is needed for yourself, and then, like I said, in that reflective supervision space, so that you can share and then get out there and try some more, because it's just, this work is never ending in that sense. You got, that's why Leslie knew to tell you that. Leslie said, I'm telling you this because I've had to learn this the hard way. There's a lot of shame and guilt around here.
Well, and yeah, and so, and I don't have a poker face, everybody who doesn't already know that. Maureen does, so.
So yes, I thank you all so much. Are there any other final questions? Got to go take my son somewhere. So is there any other questions any of you have for me before we sign off? Cindy, you're saying something. It doesn't look like you're on mute, but I can't hear you.
Yeah.
Yes.
I just wanted to thank you. You're just awesome. I've heard you before when you were in St. Pete, and I always learn so much. And thank you for everybody here for all of your comments and participation and allowing me to be open and vulnerable as well and honest. And I'll cry when I shut the laptop down.
It is always
and have a glass of red wine. Have wine and wine.
It's always a moving experience. I feel like St. Pete is my family. So then whenever someone in St. Pete picks up the phone, I think Delquanda, I did something in January with it. So does it even matter? It's like, is this somebody from St. Pete saying, can you show up in a place? And I'm like, where and when? What do you need? And so it's like, I never say no to St. Pete.
I have a townhouse in Largo with plenty of room. Come on. I'll give you Claritin if you're allergic to my cat. We'll be fine. And I have red wine.
So thank you all so much. Like I said, you always extend such grace to me. You're always so kind and listening to me. And it just warms my heart to be in collaboration with the St. Pete team.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Have a good night, everybody.
Is there anything you wanted to say before we got off? Is there anything you wanted to ask or anything? Thank you for participating. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
I'm the last one to go.